UKCBC technical problems plaguing us still, but we are joined by two so far of our historical authors who are now going to give us a little introduction to themselves.
Hi there, nice to talk to everybody. My name's Martin Lee. I actually write under the name of Evan J. Lee for no other reason than it was easier to spell my initials than write my full name. I actually write a series of genealogical mysteries featuring a character called Jane Sinclair. And basically, she is an investigator who looks into people's past and into their family history to discover mysteries that have happened, similar to things like Who Do You Think You Are on TV. I've written 7 novels so far, and the sort of historical elements have gone as far back to 1834, the passing of the Slavery Act, right up to almost modern day with the dispatch of supposedly orphaned children to Australia in the 1950s and 60s. So I spread quite a long period of time. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Chris Longmuir. I write both contemporary crime thrillers and historical murder mysteries, but today I'm concentrating on the historical murder mysteries. My main historical series is the Kirsty Campbell Mysteries. Now, Kirsty is an ex-suffragette and a pioneer policewoman. It's set in 1917 and 1919. The 2 books set in 1919 are her as the first policewoman in Dundee, although she joined the police service in London in the Metropolitan Force. This 1917 book is in Gretna, and it's, that was where the munitions factory and the munitions town were. So there's elements of sabotage and spying in that, as well as murder mystery. The 1919 ones are set in Dundee. I've also recently published, on the day of the lockout, a new book, which is Dangerous Destiny. It's a suffragette mystery, and it's part of a new series of suffragette mysteries set in 1908. And the first one starts in Dundee, but I'm hoping to take them to Edinburgh and Glasgow and finishing up in London, with the final one, because Kirsty is in this. Oh, sorry. Kirsty is in this one. But she's much younger, of course, than she is in the Kirsty Campbell Mysteries. And I want to take her story from when she becomes a suffragette right through to when she becomes a policewoman. And then that leads into the Kirsty Campbell Mysteries.
Wonderful. So how's lockdown treating you all at the moment? I know, Martin, you're kind of in an interesting place.
Yeah, I actually, I spent about 6 months of my year in Taiwan and 6 months of my year in the UK. But obviously at the moment I'm in Taiwan, rather, because it's very difficult to fly back to UK. Luckily here, life continues on as normal. There's very little, there's no real lockdown because way back in January, the government implemented tracking and tracing and testing right in, I think, almost January the 3rd they started. So here life continues on as normal. And I think there's very few, I think only 6 people have passed away so far, and I think 430 cases. So we've been very lucky here. But it means I can't fly back to England. Impossible to do.
And you're also talking to us at 8 p.m, is it, over with you?
Yeah, it's 8 p.m. here. So it's in the evening. It's dark outside and I've got the lights on here. So, and it's also 32 degrees today, so warm as well. As you can see, the aircon is behind me. So slightly different from England.
Slightly. Chris, how's lockdown treating you?
Well, as a writer, I lead quite a solitary life anyway. I am missing my markets and fairs where I sell barrow loads of paperbacks. Of course, I'm not selling any paperbacks at the moment because I'm housebound. I thought being housebound, I would get a lot of writing done, and it hasn't worked out that way. I can't seem to get my head round it at the moment, so it must be affecting me in some way. But again, it'll come. It'll come.
Frances, do you want to give us a little introduction to yourself now we've got you here?
Yes, hello. So I write the Kate Shackleton murder mystery series in the 1920s. So there are some crossovers between Chris and Martin and I in terms of the periods that we write about. And I just love doing it. And Kate is a great character to write about. And as Chris was just saying, being in lockdown, I thought, loads and loads of time to write. But it is very strange. What I have done recently is plant 2 rows of potatoes and some courgettes. And I am on with the next novel, so just keeping my fingers crossed. But I think being at home all the time and days running into each other does kind of create a very strange feeling.
I can imagine. We've already got a question for you about all. It says you must have to undertake a lot of research. Have you found out things that have surprised you? Shall we start with Mark?
Sure. Always, actually, it's what you're looking for when you're researching is things that surprise you. My background is I did my first degree was in history. I then did a postgrad degree in historical research. So I'm actually really comfortable in finding things. The biggest hassle is stopping finding things, because you can get into this black hole of research that sucks you in and sucks you in and sucks you in. I think you have to realize when to stop. For me, research is almost like 3 levels. The first level is reading some general histories of the period. The second level is memoirs. I love reading what people of the period thought about the period. And then third one is actual documents or historical documents, which you can find both online, or I find most of mine at the National Archives, which is very useful. But in the end, the research is there to give you the background of the book, is to help you tell the story. Almost once I start writing, I put the research aside and tell my story. I'll go back into the research looking for detail once I've finished. But generally, I use it as a foundation to build the story upon.
Fabulous. Frances, what about you?
Yeah, some of the same things. My degree was in history and English, and what I like to do is I like to find some of the hidden corners of history and the people whose stories may not have been told. And so I think the when and the where can be kind of a quite broad research area, thinking about what year you might be looking at and kind of where you might be going. And some very good things turn up. For instance, when I went to Haworth, I knew I wanted to set a story there, and I couldn't quite work out what that story was. So you kind of wait for something to blow in on the wind. And I met the principal curator at the Haworth Parsonage Museum, and she told me that 1928, which was the year I'd reached in my chronology, that was the year that a wealthy benefactor, a Haworth lad made good, bought the parsonage for the nation, really, and presented the keys to the Bronte Society. And it was a huge event. And so I thought, something can happen at this huge event. So there's a lot of serendipity involved, I think, as well as all of the reading, which, I do really enjoy, like Martin. I like reading people's letters and diaries.
Chris?
Yes, I'm much the same as both Martin and Frances. I think one of the memoirs. I mean, I did an article for People's Friend recently on Kitty Marion, who was an actress suffragette and once described as the most dangerous woman in Britain, which was fascinating. But I was allowed into the archives when I was doing Devil's Porridge. Now, there's a Devil's Porridge museum down in Eastriggs, which is next to Gretna. And I went down there, and the archivist was really excellent. She let me into the archives. I was able to photocopy stuff. It was brilliant. I also found an unpublished thesis online about Timbertown, which was what they called Gretna at that time, because most of the houses were wooden. And that was fascinating as well. But the things you find out, it's unbelievable. But the other thing is, of course, you've got the big research, which is the main events that are happening. But you've also got the little research, things like how things work, that kind of thing. For example, in Devil's Porridge, I had to find out how a vintage car worked. So I had to find out a car from the year. I can't remember which car it was I picked now. But I went through 3 days reading about it, looking at YouTube videos. I could have driven that car by the time I was finished. And that wound up in the book as one paragraph. So, I mean, basically, you don't put all your research in, but you do need to know it.
Yeah, and
I wonder if I could. Has research ever changed one of your books?
Oh,
As you've done the research, you found something that you made you re-look at the period.
Well, there was something for me when I was writing Dying in the Wall, and there's always that moment in a plot where you become a little stuck, and I knew what day it was because I had a perpetual calendar and I was sort of working out where we were, and I thought, well, I wonder what happened on that day in real life. And when I looked at what happened on that day, there was an explosion in a munitions factory that had been quite close to me, and I had visited the site, but I'd not sort of connected the dates and the date of the explosion. And that just sort of came in then to my story, and it allowed me to continue. It was just something that was a perfect fit. And it sounds quite callous when you say, well, that explosion was a perfect fit, but that's what we're like, really. And what you were saying about, the librarians and the archivists, they all help us hugely, and we kind of we go in and we take this stuff.
Which explosion was that, Frances?
It was the explosion at the Longmuir munitions factory outside Bradford. And also it was huge, and a lot of the people remembered it and wrote pieces that were in Bradford Library in the archives there. So I was able, and of course there were very newspaper articles about it, but not at the time, of course, much later, because they wouldn't print anything about that as it, because obviously they wouldn't want the Germans to know that they had made a hit, because generally Bradford wasn't bombed, and it was thought that it was because German merchants built a large part of Bradford, and there were very beautiful buildings. So it was, well, the Germans aren't going to drop bombs here because they built St. George's Hall.
I was racking my brains to find something that changed that for that reason, and that was what put in my mind Silvertone, the Silvertone explosion, which was why I was interested in your explosion, because when I was doing my research I came across this Silvertone explosion. Now this explosion was a complete factory in London. It's the East Victoria Docks, round about that area, and Silvertown was a kind of a small township within, on the outskirts of London, and the explosion flattened Silvertown completely. It was massive. They said the explosion was heard about in Sussex, miles away. There was molten pieces of metal thrown in the air, went over the Thames, and hit, I think it was a gasworks where the Millennium Dome is now. And and so I started off my book in Silvertown and then took them all to Gretna. But getting them to Gretna was a was a problem. One of my friends phoned me when I was in the middle of this book, says, "How are you getting on?" I said, "Not at all." I said, "I've got them all at Euston Station and I can't get them out." I was trying to get all the characters up to Gretna. I got them all there, couldn't get the damn people out. But anyway, that's by the by.
Yeah.
So I'm just about to bring in Caroline, but before I do, I'm going to leave you with a question, which is what drew you all to historical crime? And we'll start with Martin.
Oh, it's a great question. As I said, I did my degree in history, and then I worked in advertising for a long while, 25 years. And my way of relaxing was reading historical crime books. The Shard Lake series, I read all of those, and I loved it, and I ended up writing not the Jane Sinclair, but another series, a Danilov series set in Shanghai. I was living in Shanghai at the period. I remember walking down an area just behind the Bunt in Shanghai. And at the one particular corner, there are 4 old Art Deco buildings. They're still there from the 20s. And in that moment, I was almost transported back to the 1920s and 1930s of Shanghai. And it was then I decided, okay, time to write a novel about this. And I ended up writing the first of the Danilov series, which is about a Russian detective in Shanghai in the 30s, which is a lot of, or late 20s. It was actually a lot of fun to write. But I think it was something, historical crime was something I loved reading. And therefore I thought that's where I would start writing.
Well, for me, it partly started with family stories, because before I started writing crime, I wrote 3 historical sagas, and they were based on stories told to me by my mother and by other people. And so that was the kind of the first link. But when I think back just beyond that, when I was at uni, I was studying the 17th century, and I got really interested in the Pendle Witches, and I wrote a radio play about the Pendle Witches. And I had done quite a bit of radio. I'd done stories, I'd done plays for radio, and so that was my first very big piece. It was in the day when people were meant to have longer attention spans, and it was 90 minutes long, and it was just wonderful to write. And so I think those were the 2 hooks. It was the family, and it was reading history and coming up with stories, and also, as Martin said, enjoying reading historical crime.
It's funny, I'm just doing the Pendle Witches at the moment. It's I think not the next one, it'll be the 9th Jane Sinclair story will be a Pendle Witch story.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
it's fascinating period. I love it. It's wonderful to research. And so it's funny that we've all got these, and also I've done some suffragette work as well. So it's funny how it all goes through.
Yes. We're all playing the same furrows, aren't we?
Yeah, because I think they're just as you talk about family history, they're interesting periods to read about and to also to research. That's one of the things we do, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, my interest in historical actually came about with what I was doing before I became a novel writer, because I've been writing for 30 years, but not always novels. And I did an awful lot of article writing with the odd short story thrown in here and there. And I also did the Forfar street theatre, which was the Forfar Witches. Back to witches.
They're around.
I did a monologue on the back Forfar Witches, and I was asked to do the street theatre, so I did that, and it was acted out. It was enacted all over the streets of Forfar, at the different sites. But coming back to my interest in history, it was the articles mainly, because all my articles were mainly historical, social history more than. I mean, I'm not interested in kind of the kings and queens and dates and battles and things like that. I'm interested in how the ordinary people lived, how life was, and I wrote an awful lot of articles. In fact, my first book, which wasn't a crime book at all, was a historical saga set in the fishing and whaling communities. And then that came from my article research. And then The Death Game, which was the second book I wrote, which wasn't published at the time. And it rose from my research into women police. And then, of course, the women police research led on to the suffragette research, because not a lot of people know, but the early women's police services were voluntary services. They were attached to the Met, but they were voluntary. They weren't paid by the police. They were paid by the voluntary societies, but they worked with the police. And they rose from the suffragette societies. They were set up in 1914 at the start of the First World War. And it was the WSPU and the Women's Freedom League who set up the first 2 women's police services. There were 2 kind of different police services who kind of were opposed each other. One was a kind of more like a social work service. That was the one that arose from the NUWSS, which is the National Union of Women's Social, whatever. And the other one was the one set up by the Women's Freedom League, which had Margaret Damer Dawson as its lead, and can't remember the name of the other one. And the 2 of them set up this police force. So they kind of worked, and they were more like a police force. They worked with the police. They went out on patrols. They weren't allowed to arrest anyone, so they had to have a policeman trailing behind them to do the arresting. It was a fascinating period. It was fascinating to study, and that's basically where my historicals came from. But funnily enough, it was one of my contemporary ones. It was my first published one, and that was the 4th book I'd written. you know, because I still had the saga in the bottom drawer, I had the death game, the historical murder mystery, and I had the first of the Dundee crime series in the bottom drawer. The bottom drawer is the hard disk of my computer, by the way. And my fourth, Deadwood, which hit the jackpot, and I got a publisher. So that was quite an exciting time, but that was contemporary. So then after, you know, I did a third one in the contemporary, and then I went back to my first love, historical murder mysteries, resurrected the death game, published it, went on to Devil's Porridge, and then Death of a Doxy, and now Dangerous Destiny. So that's my timeline.
Right.
That's me.
I just popped in.
Oh, hi, Caroline. Long time no see.
Hi there.
Hi.
Good afternoon.
Yep.
Oh, Caroline.
Excuse my messy room. I couldn't get in the normal way, so I'm in the middle of this isn't my house. I just popped in here. Okay.
We believe you.
I was going to say, when you're asking why I write history, I actually write primarily around the first two world wars, and that's because they both impacted my family. So I have a very personal connection to what's going on there. And I've always been much more interested in the impacts on people, usually at the home front, rather than actually in the war itself. So that's what I'm writing about, something that kind of made a difference to who I am. And I mean, my parents both lived through the Blitz in London. They tried to send one of them away, but they tried to send my mother away, but her sister was terrified of cows. I thought they were far more scary than doodlebugs. So they came back and they lived through it, and yeah. So it kind of feels, I didn't see any of it, but it feels very real.
Mm.
I think we've got another question, actually. It says, Pendle is such an atmospheric place. Where else have you visited that offers the same feeling, and what settings have you used in a book that you've loved to visit? Maybe we'll start with you, Caroline.
Right. Well, mine is set around London and the places that I've made up. I have to say there is an incredible museum in the north of England, in Yorkshire, called Eden Camp, which looks at militaria and real stories throughout the First and Second World War, but it does so without glorifying war, if you like. And I went there years ago and I loved it. And very recently I took my sons there as well. And I think it's an incredible place. It's meant to be a small family run museum, but it's got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it really gives you a sense of what it was like in some aspects of the war. Other than that, I think most of my places are in my head. I do dream about places. Yeah, I do dream about places that I write about, and I bring things into reality. But I think, yeah, most of mine is the worlds that I create inside.
I set a story in Harrogate, and I thought, well, who would live in Harrogate in the 1920s? And I thought, well, there will be ladies of limited means. There will be retired army officers. And I thought, well, what war would they have fought in? So it's not the kind of the whole setting of the book, but I do have passages set during the Boer War, and that took me to Cape Town, to the museum there. And it was really interesting to see war from the point of view of two different nations, even the names of the war were different. And I'd seen in the Royal Armouries here in Leeds a photograph which showed a farmhouse that had been wrecked, and the caption was that it had been wrecked by Boers by Boers or by Kaffirs, and the same picture in Cape Town was said to have been wrecked by the British. So you just get those opposite points of view, and it was really fascinating to do that, and also just kind of getting a feeling for the times, because although it's so close in many ways, everything has changed an awful lot in the way people's attitudes, and what shocks somebody then wouldn't shock somebody now.
Oh, is it me?
Yeah.
And I just Whitby, because who wouldn't love to go to Whitby?
Frances not
And
finished.
I had the great pleasure of staying in a hotel that was built during the Tudor period and said to be haunted, and climbing the 199 steps to St Mary's and the Abbey, and being able to set the expenses against tax. What other kind of line of work could you do something like that?
Well, I suppose, I mean, my books are set quite close to home. I set most of my books in Dundee, apart from the Gretna one. And I live 30 miles north of Dundee. So I go through there and I walk about, if I'm setting a scene, I'll walk the scene before I put it in the book. But I find the Howth Graveyard, which is a historic graveyard in Dundee, a great place for my books. I mean, atmospheric, oh yes. It's a lovely place for a body dump. But I've used it in I've used it in the Death Game, and I've used it in Dangerous Destiny. The other place in Dundee that's quite atmospheric and quite creepy is Templeton Woods. Now, Templeton Woods, if people are old enough to remember, there were 2 bodies found there about 30, 40 years ago, and the crimes were never solved. And there was also a recent attack there, which was almost a murder by someone who had been paroled from prison, a murderer who had been paroled from prison, and the woman almost died. So I used that in one of mine, but it wasn't one of my historical ones, it was one of my contemporary ones. So those are the most, what would you say, atmospheric places. But like Caroline, most of the places are in my mind, and you don't want to get into the mind of a crime writer.
No, I often think if anybody ever looked at our search history on Google,
Yeah.
everything, all these red marks will be flashing up.
Well, I was looking up silent killing last night.
I know, it's frightening, isn't it? Well, I think I was looking up hanging. It was, what actually physically happens when somebody gets hanged.
Well,
So
I'm doing a lot of work around the SOE at the moment for the next one of these. She said, flashing her book. And they had a little handbook that they gave out to them, which you can actually get nowadays, which I thought was fascinating. So it was, how you could be an agent. This is what you were given if you were going to become an SOE agent, but it doesn't have anything about killing, because that was so I had to go and find Fairbairn and Sachs's book on silent killing. Doesn't look
I think people do look at what we're looking at, because I'm sure we're tracked by Microsoft and Google, and I think that explains why, when on Microsoft, which I've now stopped using, I've switched to Apple partly because of that, various news items pop up, and I'm sure that people who have been researching crime, because they always give me the creeps. I mean, the horrible stories about quite nasty crimes and things that are happening to people on death row in America. And I think, why am I being shown this? And then someone said, well, it's because you're always researching crime. So it comes back to bite us sometimes.
Yeah, and people do track, or certainly Google tracks everything you search. On the previous question, for me, I think I walked up Pendle Hill about a year ago. Again, a beautiful place and wonderfully atmospheric. But my favorite place is probably from the Danneloth novels, which is Shanghai. As a city, I think it's the biggest, or it has the most number of Art Deco buildings in the world still, simply because after 1949, when China became communist, Shanghai didn't change for 50 years, way until the late 1990s, it began to change. So all the old buildings are still there. And when I lived in Shanghai, I used to live in an old Art Deco building. And it had this wonderful, decadent atmosphere, which you can imagine what Shanghai was like. And just wandering the streets, you can feel the old Shanghai. Unfortunately, most of it's now being knocked down, which is a shame. All in the cause of progress, and they're building these ugly buildings in their place. But never mind. So if you have got a chance, visit Shanghai now. You won't be there much longer. I think we've got another question, which is, what have been your most memorable moments as authors? Caroline, would you like to start?
Yeah,
I'm giving you the difficult one.
I'm struggling here because I'm thinking, okay, if it's a memorable moment, it should be happening. I don't know. I mean, I've seen people who say the memorable moments are when the books appear on the shelf, when the books appear in a bookshop, when the things appear in a box in front of you. But to be perfectly honest, it was such a long, hard slog to get published. I was so tired by the time it came through. It was just sort of like, oh, thank God. I mean, yeah. I won't say it was harder than giving birth. I've done that twice, and that is a very different experience. But I think probably the most memorable thing happened recently. My younger son is 12, and he has also been doing research into World War II, as it happens, because that's what they're doing at primary school. So he was asking me questions and asking his granddad things and getting interested. And he was looking along the books in one of the rooms that we have. And I said, well, no, this shelf is just books I've written. And he just sort of stopped. And the penny finally dropped that his mother has a shelf of books that are just by him. And he went, wow. And I felt terribly proud in that moment, because my elder son, who's now 18, used to tell everybody at his primary school that I was a typist, because that's what he saw me doing all the time. So I think otherwise the memorable bits are really, for me, just the stories that stay with me. And every time somebody actually drops you a line, I don't want to name names on the air, and says, I really enjoyed this, or people, some people have been asking whether or not I'm going to kill off certain characters in the Spanish flu because they don't want to lose them. And that's really nice. I mean, every time somebody says that they enjoy the book, or that they want to know what happens to a character because they love them, I mean, that's brilliant. So that's probably it.
But for me, I think I think probably we're all like this. When we start a book, there's a lot of uncertainty. You think, will it work? Will I be able to pull it off? And then sometimes there's just that visceral moment that comes when you know that it's going to be all right. And so I think that's a kind of important moment for me. And as Caroline was just saying as well, it's sometimes hearing from people. For instance, I've heard from people who say having a course of chemo, and one of them said, oh, the nurse said to me, you must like that writer's books because you were reading her during the last course of chemo. And I think I think it's really rewarding to think that you might be helping someone through a difficult time. And similarly, I think this was a man on Twitter saying he was very depressed and he couldn't read anything, but he could read my books for whatever reason. And so that can be really rewarding.
Well, I suppose for me, it's a no-brainer, because I think it was the publication of my first book. Now, the only reason my first book was published, it was the fourth book I'd written, it wasn't the first I'd written. The only reason it was published was because I won the Dundee International Book Prize. And that was a prize that was going around at the time. I think they've halved the prize money now, but it was a fantastic prize. Off the prize money, I bought an Apple Mac computer. I treated myself to a trip on the Orient Express to Venice and back, both ways on the Orient Express, 5 days in Venice. Brilliant. So I'm not telling you how much money it was, but it was a lot. But the main thing for that was, along with winning the prize money, you got a publishing deal. And that was my first step into publication. And I can remember standing outside Waterson's and this great big cardboard thing of me in the window with the pile of books, and standing there going, oh, you know, and then going in and kind of making love to the book. That was my memorable moment. No brainer, that one.
I think mine was when I wrote the fourth book I wrote in the Jane Sinclair series. It's called The Banished Child, and it really deals with the supposed orphans, most weren't orphans, who were sent to Australia in the 50s and early 60s. And when they got to Australia, they were treated appallingly and basically by both the various nunneries and the places they were put to work at the age of 7 or 8 years old. I actually got a letter when I published the book after about 4 months from one of the children who'd been sent to Australia. And he said he was sent to Perth. He was sent to the school, supposedly, that I wrote about. And he basically said that I captured the period and what happened to them very well. And I think that was what was one of the first times I realized that what I wrote had an effect on people, other than simply, oh, it's an enjoyable book to write. But the fact that I managed to capture his experience of life at a particularly vicious institution was my memorable moment. It's something I've stayed with me. It's on my desk, actually above my desk just over there, to remind me that your job is to capture that moment, you know, for people when you're writing, even if it's a very light study, it's still your job. We have another question. Actually, not to do with crime writing.
Can I ask before you start? What was the name of your book?
It's called
What's the name of your book?
The number 4 is called The Banished Child. It's the
I'm just wondering if I've read it as part of my research, because I did articles that were published in this country and in America on the children who were, you know, the lost children. I did an article, and you know, it was, you know, I read at that time on that subject.
I wrote about 2 years ago. There was 2 waves of it, very quickly, from about 1870 to 1920 in Canada, when about 100,000 children were sent from England. And there was a second wave after the war into Australia, when about, nobody knows the exact figure, it could be anything from 30 to 50,000 children were sent to Australia. And
I knew a woman.
Dumped.
I knew a woman who, and now her mother lived along the road from her, and I think she was one of the ones that was in Australia. Her and her sister were sent to Australia during the war years. Well, around about that time, her father had been a Polish, pretty high up in the Polish army, and he'd been over here and he died, and the widow was left a kind of, you know, penniless. So she put the children into care for 6 months, planning to get them back after 6 months. And in that 6 months, they shipped them both to Australia. They told them their mother had died, and that she searched Australia for them and found them. She actually physically searched Australia for them. It was absolutely fascinating.
Wow.
Martin's vanished. Where's he gone?
He's coming back.
We've lost Martin, sorry. I'll just give you the question that he would have asked you, which is, have any unexpected things happened to you because of your writing? Shall we start with Caroline?
Every time. When I was at primary school, I'd always decided I wanted to be a writer, and I always used to tell people stories. And I was only popular really when I was telling a decent story. That is what I discovered. But we had a teacher who came in. She's probably dead now. I think I'm old enough that she's dead. Her name was Mrs. Leckie, and she looked around at our class and she said, turned to the headmaster and said, "This lot, there'll never be more than shop assistants, you know," which is very rude about shop assistants who are doing a brilliant job, especially right now. So I'll add that in. But she was trying to say that none of us were going to achieve our dreams. And the Death at the Races, which I've just brought out, which is the latest Euphemia, is again, I didn't get to introduce myself, my 15th book. So I think my most unexpected things are that I'm still getting published. That I have something like 30 books behind me now. And while I've never hit a Lee Child status, and I doubt that I ever will, although that would be nice, I'm still here. And I think I find that unexpected every day, and a delight that people are reading my stories. And it is when people come up to you and say, "I've been reading about your story," or "What's happening to this character?" or you're in the library and somebody will say, "Oh, that's you wrote this." And you realize that those stories that I used to tell at primary school, the stories that I have in my head, the stories that are part of who I am, who I couldn't live without my stories, have become something that I'm sharing, not just in Scotland, but all over the world. I get letters from people like I had one from somebody in New Zealand because apparently their local library isn't stocking all the euphemias, and could I please sort this out? Which I couldn't. I just, sort of made some suggestions, and but yeah, people from all over the place write to me or email me. I'm quite easy to find on the internet deliberately, and say that they are enjoying my world, and that I think is amazing. That's me. I'd like to say I've been taken into MI6 and I've talked to all the spies and everything like that, but I couldn't tell you anything about that anyway, even if I had.
Frances?
Well, I think in thinking about writing rather than sort of about life, I belong to a library that is the oldest subscription library in the country. It's called the Leeds Library. And it was the kind of library that I think people had to die before someone else could join for a long time. It had a kind of elitism about it. And then I realised at a certain point that I could join. And so I joined that library some years ago now. And it is such a wonderful place to go and sit and research and read. And I hadn't really thought about setting anything there until I heard or read that there had been a ghost in the library of a former librarian. And I just thought that was just such a great story. And it prompted me to write about that library and bring a story in there. And so that was just one of those nice little unexpected things that can pop up for you when you're writing. And thinking about what Caroline was just saying, how some of us just were never expected to achieve. I was one of those girls who was never expected to achieve because I failed my 11 plus. I think I never realized that you were meant to take school seriously. And so it was very surprising for me when I one day during a postal strike saw that the dates for submitting an essay to Ruskin College in Oxford for entry had been postponed because of the postal strike, and here were the titles. And I wrote an essay, sent it in, had an interview, and then had 2 years at Ruskin College and 3 years at York University, just doing lots of reading. And this was a time when you could get a grant as a mature student. And so it just felt like an unbelievable stroke of luck to be able to go somewhere and read and just have somebody pay for the privilege. And so I feel so sorry now for students who rack up huge debts and don't have the advantage that I had at that time.
Hi there, I'm back. I got lost in the ether, I think, for a while. It happens. Yeah, but the rest of it vanished, of course.
I've been trying to think of unexpected things, and everything, as Caroline said, is unexpected. I mean, I never expected to be a published writer. I didn't expect, to sell books. When I did start to publish, I didn't expect to sell any. But I think the thing that really caught me unawares was when I was first asked to do a library talk. And I'd been invited to this talk by a librarian, and I was assuming in my innocence that I was part of the audience, and I was the speaker. So that was totally unexpected. But since then, I've become a bit more blasé about those kind of things. The other unexpected thing was more of a negative. And that was, a lot of people start out as independently published and then go into traditional publishing. I did it the other way around. I started out as a traditionally published, and I'm now independently published. Now, that was fine. When I started to do the move over on both counts, I was doing panels at a crime festival every year. I did spotlights and I did panels every year. As soon as I got rid of my traditional publisher completely, and I went to say, can I be on a panel next year? Oh no, you're not allowed, you're an indie. And that was totally unexpected, because I thought, well, why was I eligible to go on panels last year and the year before and the year before? But now that I'm doing it myself, I'm not eligible. And I find that really, really odd. It hasn't put me off going to the festival, though. Anyway,
there's a nice question coming in actually, is what challenges does writing historical crime pose?
challenge.
I think it's easier. I mean, I deliberately, when I started writing, picked 1910 because the police weren't particularly present, especially in the locations that I was using, and that basically if you were of sufficient class, you could say, "Go away, Mr. Policeman, we'll find out who killed it ourselves," or him, or whatever. And forensics were extremely limited. So it was all about, for my characters, about personality, and it wasn't about sort of like minute by minute timing or about police things. It was about people digging out stories and finding out what happened behind other things. So I like historical crime for that reason. There's not too many techno gadgets.
It's true. Actually, I write both. I write contemporary crime, set in Manchester right now. I also write historical crime. With historical crime, you don't have any of the whiz bangs you have these days with things like DNA, telephone tracking, all the various stuff they can do in forensic science. Forensic science was very limited when I was writing for the 1930s. Very, very little bits were there, but very, very little. Certainly there was no blood tests or no antigen tests. And in terms of phones, there wasn't even obviously no mobile phones, and very, very few public phones. So you can't just call the police. How do you get them to the crime? How do people do that sort of thing? So it's very interesting, very different doing both. But it's a challenge, and it's fun to do.
Whereas I wrote I'll say very quickly, I wrote some modern stuff as well, a Daniel Truce series for a German publisher, and phone signal kept dying. All bits of technology kept breaking down. Technology. I wanted the stories of the people and how they felt.
Yeah, I think it's much more interesting to kind of emphasize the psychology of something rather than the forensics and the pathology, and just to explore things, the motives and what makes people tick and those sorts of things. And also when we're writing historical crime, there were very different attitudes that prevail sometimes. And so I think it's also a matter of ensuring that readers understand, are kind of let in on how people are thinking, so that what shocked someone in the 1920s might not shock someone now. And things change as well when the law changes, when it becomes easier for people to divorce, then there are less, perhaps less crimes involved in between husbands and wives or those sorts of things. So I think it's kind of trying to get a take on the times and be truthful to the time that you're writing about, while also being aware that a modern reader might come with a whole different set of assumptions, and so there's kind of a drawing in and a balancing of the story set then and the reader who is in the now.
I can relate to everything you're all saying. I mean, a lot of that applies to me as well. But the other challenge, of course, is getting everything right. Are you sure you've got everything right? All the little things, did the police stations have telephones? Were they in every police station? This kind of thing, the tiny things. I mean, I was reading a book, a very good book, actually, and I really enjoyed it. But something threw me out of it right at the beginning. And it was set in 1912. And the main character tipped the bellboy £0.50. Now, £0.50 in 1912 would be £297 today. I looked it up. And I thought, who tips a bellboy £0.50 in 1912? So that threw me out. So it's getting all those little things right. What did you pay for a newspaper? Tuppence. All those kind of things, the little things, just getting them right. And the other thing, of course, is modern language. Now, I don't write my novels in a historical, the language is not historical. But at the same time, you can't have ultra-modern language in a historical. So it's kind of avoiding the word that sounds too modern. And I think those are the main challenges when you're writing historical.
I very occasionally put bits of Scots in one of my books because I had a character who spoke very well, until he got really annoyed, and then he went into Scots. And I got so many complaints from Americans saying it hadn't been proofread properly. But I do. But the same thing about language. I have a character that uses contractions all the time, and nobody else does. And people who get involved with him start using contractions. And I actually watch that when I'm writing and change people. I don't think anybody notices but me. But
No.
But yes, language and the use of language and how we express ourselves and what people at that time believed and what they adhered to. Even the idea in the times that I'm writing that everybody has a place in the world and you stay in your place is a huge thing.
I have a new editor in my Dangerous Destiny book. I have people who talk in contractions, but I also have people who talk very formally. And she changed all my formal speech into contractions. I had to change them all back again.
There's a couple of personal questions. One for Chris. Do you really have a typing cat?
No, Lucy gave me a typing cat. And every time I make a comment, I get the typing cat. So I love the typing cat. I wish the typing cat would type would do my books. I mean, they might be better. They might be nice.
I wish would type mine. And one for Carolyn. It says, with Euphemia due to marry Bertram, will that be the end of the crime solving?
I seem to have lost sound from everyone else. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
I'm afraid I can't hear you.
No, difficult to answer that question then. So I'll move on to, there's another question that says, if you had a TARDIS, or what to start afresh with a new crime period, what would you choose? What period would you choose? Which would you choose, Frances?
I don't know. I think it would be a choice between the 17th century and the 19th century. There's some really interesting stories that I came up that were in footnotes. You know, the kind of footnotes of history books. And there's one in particular that a situation that changed the law. I think I would maybe go back and just watch what was going on at that time in it was Clitheroe and Blackburn, when a man abducted his wife because she wouldn't live with him, and it happened on a bank holiday, and people came from miles around to see this spectacle of the woman being held prisoner in this room. And luckily for her, she was from a legal family. And so they eventually had to go as far as the High Court with this, and a decision was made in her favour. So I think I might go back to that because it was such a kind of weird and wonderful story. And also it would be something that I'm familiar with, I think, the 19th century. Maybe I ought to be more daring and go a little bit farther back. What about you then? Where would you go to, Martin?
I actually know where I want to go to, but I haven't got time to go there, which is a period from 1690 to 1745, which I know it's the period in Irish history called the Wild Geese. Mm-hmm. It was when the nobles, after the defeat by the Prince of Orange, the nobles left in 1690 from Limerick, and they ended up fighting for all the armies of France and Spain and Germany until 1745. And it's a fascinating period, and that's why you have so many Irish names in France and so many Irish names in Spain. They were basically from that period. Things like Hennessy, brandy, Lynchbage is a Bordeaux wine, and they all came out of 1690, leaving the UK, which is a bit of a shame. So one day I'll write the Wild Geese story eventually.
Oh, look forward to that.
Yeah, it's an amazing period.
Yeah, TARDIS, I think I would step in and go everywhere. You know, I'm just curious. I like to know how everything works. I like to know how people lived long ago. I liked everything. But in the main, I suppose I would go back to my own period that I write about so that I could take part, smell the smells, live the life, soak in the atmosphere. It would be marvellous.
And Caroline, you're still with us?
I'm back again. I can hear you again. Where would I go? I'd probably go back to 1910, between 1910 and 1914, as the world was changing then. I think that's a really fascinating time.
Final question: any new upcoming releases that you guys want to tell people about?
Well, I've got a question I can see up here from me, which I can answer that and answer this. Somebody's asking whether or not once Euphemia gets married, does her crime stuff end? Of course it doesn't. This is the first book after that, which is the current book out, A Death at the Races, in which she's being taken off on the Monte Carlo rally without her husband. He's not happy. I've just finished the draft of A Death in the Hospital, which maybe not the most appropriate name, but it was set 2 years ago, which is the next Euphemia, and that will be out later this year. And I'm now working on the next in the Hope series, which doesn't yet have a title. It is Hope for something, but we don't know yet. And it's all about what became just before the SOE, which were auxiliary units. It was when they thought that Britain was about to be invaded by Germany, and we really didn't stand a chance. So they set up all these groups to go underground and set up all these dens so that they could continue a guerrilla warfare when the invasion happened. So it's set around about then, and that's out next year. And currently, if I'm allowed to plug this, I'm going to anyway, if you sign up to my newsletter, and you can find me online anywhere, you have a chance of winning a copy of A Death in the Races, because my publisher's giving them away, giving me 10 to give away, which I'm allocating randomly. So that's me.
Frances?
Oh, the book that I'm working on at present, it's called, in Britain it's going to be called Death and the Brewery Queen, and in the USA it will be called Murder is in the Air. And I won't say anything more about it because I'm still writing it, so sitting with my fingers crossed. What about you? What about you, Mark?
I'm at the moment I'm just into editing also copy editing my next book in the contemporary series, which is the Ribpath book, and that will be released in September. And then I am writing the next Jane Sinclair story, which all I can tell you at the moment is it's Dickensian. So it is set in the period of 1850 in London, actually, which I normally avoid like the plague. But this time I've decided to travel south. And as I say, I'm researching the Pendle Witches story, and that'll come out, I think, probably March or April next year. But I'm just researching at the moment, and it's fascinating. And you, Chris?
Right, well, as I said, this one came out, can you see it? On the week of the lockdown, which means that my paperback sales locally are zero. Although it's selling online, and I'm getting quite good feedback about it. It's Dangerous Destiny, a Suffragette mystery, and it's the first in a series of Suffragette mysteries. Whether there are more in the series depends on how well this one sells, and if the lockdown lasts for 2 years, you won't see one for another 2 years. The one I'm currently working on, which has started about 10,000 words in, which I can't get my head down to write. Maybe it's because I've been in the historical so long, is a contemporary one. And it features a pole dancer and a kind of a setup and a gangster who's being set up by someone we know not whom. And it's in its early stages. So
I think I've just got a message from Caroline saying that that's time. So I maybe just talking to ourselves, of course, and nobody listening at the moment.
Nobody's listening. It's nice talking to you all.
It's been lovely meeting you anyway.
It's been nice talking to you all. And if anybody's listening, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you too.
Actually, once I get off, sorry. Once I get off, I'll actually order your books, because I need to, after learning about them, I really need to read them now. Particularly, I've done something about Greenock and suffragettes as well. So fascinating stuff.
That's good. That's good. Well, I've read Caroline's books. I've read Frances's books, and I'm reading yours at the moment.
Oh, at least if nothing else, there'll be 3 more sales for everybody. Which
Yeah,
will be good.
yeah.
You all need the sales.
Oh yes, particularly in these hard times.
Okay, they're still listening. Apparently, I've just got the message.
Are
Okay.
they? Oh well.
So, okay. So now we're getting. Thank you so much. Thanks, guys. Everybody just want to say goodbye.
Yeah. Bye bye. Thank you for
Bye.
watching.